Great. We have 278 participants registered from 49 countries, representing a diverse group of participants this morning, from implementing international NGOs, donors and governments, as well as private companies. So we're very pleased to have you. As you know, meeting the needs of the global youth population requires evidence-based, scalable, and sustainable initiatives. In response, Making Sense International offers a demand-driven knowledge management platform that builds the capacity of stakeholders worldwide to design, implement, and evaluate high-impact programs, policies, and partnerships. This webinar, Youth Voices, Changing Narratives and Engaging Youth, is part of the Apply It webinar series, and we provide the global youth development community with a convenient opportunity to learn from other organizations about concrete tools and knowledge they can apply to their work. Webinar participants, thank you so much again for joining us for today's discussion on storytelling and youth engagement. Thank you also to our partners at RTI International for hosting this webinar with us, and for our speakers for sharing your expertise. Participants, we welcome your questions and contributions throughout this virtual learning event. Please write them in the chat box that's located at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We also welcome your tweeting and Facebook posts on key points you take away from this event using the hashtag YouthEO. Our moderator for today's event is Ami Thakar. Ami is an international development professional with 16 years experience working with the U.S. government, global non-governmental organizations, including the International Youth Foundation and RTI International, the World Bank, on programs that improve the lives of children, young people, and women. Ami's career has focused on issues in youth entrepreneurship and employment, career counseling and job placement, technical and vocational education and training, TVET, youth leadership and volunteerism, life skills, basic and non-formal education, child labor, and gender. She currently serves as Senior Specialist in Youth and Workforce Development for RTI International's International Development Group, strengthening RTI's efforts to align education systems with labor market demand and transitioning young people into jobs. And with that, Ami, I'll turn it over to you.
Really excited to be the moderator of this session. It's a topic that's close to my heart, and I hope that we'll have a lively and engaging discussion, and I hope the participants will be able to share their feedback by chatting. Before I tee up the session and introduce our panelists, I would actually like to ask the participants who are online to quickly respond to the question that you see up on the screen in the right-hand box. So I'm going to read the question for you. How successful do you think your organization is at in telling youth stories? You have the options to select very much so, some success, and not really at all. And so this is a great little feature here because we'll be able to see the responses in real time. And we'll get to reflect on that as a group in a few minutes. So if you can do that now, that would be great. So to put today's session in context, let me just share actually the impetus for having this webinar in the first place on youth voices. I think as development practitioners, we all agree that youth unemployment has risen to the level of a crisis issue. In fact, some call it the coming tsunami. We know this is not about youth missing out on an ideal summer job or part-time work, but that this is really about millions of young people struggling to find jobs over the coming decade. It's about a profound lack of viable opportunities that young people face to provide for themselves and their families, and really the associated negative social and economic impacts which are going to affect generations to come. And you know the statistics, we've heard them all. Over 600 million young people not in education, training, or work. For me, these numbers are not only huge, but they're frankly mind-numbing. We know that the stakes are high, and yet for whatever reason, this issue continues to lag behind other big development topics. For example, climate change or girls' education. And when I say lag behind, I think of it in terms of collective impact. One big constraint, we believe, is communication, particularly the lack of first-person narratives and first-person accounts from young people themselves. What we don't hear often are the stories behind the labor statistics or the labor data. And this is a real barrier because we know that effective stories create movements, they galvanize communities, they raise resources, and importantly, they lead to some change, they lead to impact, they lead to moving the needle. So let's talk about how we do that. Let's talk about how youth voices and how storytelling can be used as a tool to move towards that collective impact for youth economic opportunities. I'm really excited because we have a great group of panelists. I want to briefly introduce them. We're very fortunate because they each bring and share a unique perspective on this topic. I'm not going to delve into their lengthy bios. You've seen them online, hopefully, and that's one of the reasons you're here participating with us. But let me start off with Charlie Sennett. He's an award-winning journalist and co-founder of Global Post and the Ground Truth Project. If you haven't heard about Ground Truth, Google them. They're an amazing organization. It's a nonprofit media organization that's training the next generation of journalists in social justice journalism. We also have Marielle Davis, who is heading up communications for Education for Employment, or EFE, as many of you may know the organization. They're a leading NGO in the Middle East, and they've done some pioneering work on what it takes to get young people trained and employed in very difficult circumstances. And finally, we have Julie Dixon, who is currently research director at the National Journal and formerly heading up Georgetown Center for Social Impact Communication. This is really an industry-leading resource on the role of communication in fostering social change. So very fortunate and thankful for them taking the time to be in this webinar. As far as how the next hour is going to play out, we're going to break up the next hour into about 30 minutes of back and forth with the panelists. We will then have about 20 minutes for question and answer, so we really do encourage you to write in any questions you may have. We're going to conclude by sharing some tools and resources that your organization can access to help create and share first-person youth narratives. So let's just kind of look at this poll. It's interesting. The overwhelming majority of you are saying that you've had some success, and a few of you, about 6%, very much so. And the thing that we want to get to is being able to say that not just as organizations, but on the issue of youth unemployment, that we need to be having a lot more success in telling the story. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to kick this off with Charlie, who's going to give us the big picture. Charlie, based on your experience covering the Middle East and Arab Spring, what narratives are we fundamentally missing when it comes to the youth unemployment crisis? And tell us, what is the cost of that missing narrative? Tell us why it's not enough to tell this youth unemployment story in the third person. Charlie?
Thanks, Ami. I think the biggest reveal of the story of the Arab Spring in 2011 was that many of us who covered the Middle East for a really long time missed the story. We failed to hear a chorus of disenchantment, a chorus of discontent that was rising up among young people. And I think that what really happened was we were just completely missing out on a story that was there, which was about youth unemployment, which was about the lack of opportunity and the lack of real jobs and the frustration that that was creating inside this huge swath of humanity in the Middle East, young people. So Facebook emerged and really gave voice to this, and it ignited a revolution that many of us remember and saw on television. I was there in Tahrir Square for every day of the events as they unfolded and had a chance to really have what they call the Tahrir moment, which is to hear the stories of these young people who for the first time in their lives felt empowered and felt like their stories were being heard. And I felt really honored to be there on the ground capturing those stories and finding their stories online through Facebook and through social media, because the power of the moment was that they were telling their own stories. This wasn't in the third person anymore. Journalists out there just telling the story in a third person way, but hearing it in their first person voices was critical. So I think some of the other takeaways were that social media, while it was a powerful platform, is not enough. That Facebook didn't cause a real revolution. It caused a civil uprising, but then it didn't know where to go. There wasn't enough engagement. There wasn't a plan. There wasn't political action. There weren't enough solutions in the air. So I think going forward, the story we can't miss now is to hear from those young people about what is it that they see as the way forward. What, again, are their stories in the first person that we need to hear about innovation, about entrepreneurial spirit, about how they want to create jobs, how they see their future. And we have to find the platforms for them to express that. Ami?
Know that the youth unemployment story, on the one hand, is of hope and potential, but as you rightly pointed out, it's also of very dire consequences for these young people. Which story do you think, being a media person, what's the media more interested in telling?
Well, I think the media is always drawn to stories of struggle and stories of crisis. I mean, that is what rivets our attention as human beings, and I don't necessarily fault the media for pursuing those stories. They're really important to tell. Our job is to shed light where light needs to go, and that's often where the biggest problems are. But that said, we're going to miss the story if we don't also look at really dramatic stories of success, of innovation, of hope, of people who want to see their lives turn around and do better. And innovation, entrepreneurial spirit, how people can, even on a very small scale, be entrepreneurs, or on a very big scale, become entrepreneurs, is, I think, one of the most important stories for us to seek out, and again, find the ways to share it, whether that's through user-generated content or paying attention to social media where all of these stories are unfolding if we're there listening to them. Ami?
So tell us, Charlie, in your experience, what then are these media platforms that youth organizations, international organizations, local organizations should be targeting at the different levels? And how does that change the story or one's communication strategy based on the level or the platform?
Well, I think we have to pay attention to social media. I think everybody knows that. I think Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and a myriad of other social media platforms are really important for us to be part of the conversation, to find out how people are telling their stories. But I think what's really needed is for us to leverage the power of good old-fashioned storytelling, the discipline of storytelling, fact-based journalistic approaches to storytelling, and empower a new generation to get away from what I think is sometimes this lazy venue for opinion, and come out with some really thoughtful ways to express themselves and to tell their own story. I talk to a lot of young people around the world on occasion on college campuses, or when I'm on assignment in places like Egypt or in Iraq or other places where I'm connecting with young people. I'm sort of struck by the fact that as much as they are aware of social media and as many digital points there are in their lives, they don't have a great ability to pull that together into their own story and to really tell it powerfully. I think we need to find new ways to give them a platform to do that. We need to teach this generation to tell their own story, and we need to come up with new models for that. And I think user-generated content is going to be a big area where that happens, and we're working really hard on that through our platform called Youth Voices, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Ami?
Thanks, Charlie. Thank you for that. I think that really helped us get some of the bigger picture around what's missing in the story for young people. Let's take this down to some practical experiences that, Marielle, you've had as the communications manager at EFE. You must have had many success stories of young people learning a new skill or getting new jobs or finding a career that's right for them. Tell us what's been so hard for you about telling that story, and talk to us about some of the challenges as well as some of your responses in telling that story about young people, and particularly how you've engaged young people in that process. Give us those top three for us, if you could.
Thanks, Ami. As you mentioned, Education for Employment has an organizational commitment to helping the youth we've trained and placed in jobs to share their stories. And these stories are a tool for catalyzing action. They have the ability to convince more youth to join training programs, to convince or inspire donors to support market-driven youth employment models, and also to convince employers in the private sector of the business case for hiring young job seekers. But despite the tremendous utility of stories, we've encountered some real challenges in telling them. We've developed some responses, and there's still a long way to go, which is why I'm particularly excited that something like Youth Voices exists. And I would say that our first big obstacle that we face is that many of the young people who we work with simply aren't familiar with the concept of personal storytelling in a formal way. And they aren't necessarily aware that their stories have real power. It's been our experience that to really hit home, a story needs to give an honest assessment of the harsh realities of unemployment, maybe from a financial or psychological or personal family perspective. But in the Middle East and North Africa, where Education for Employment operates, it isn't necessarily common to focus so much on an individual. And acknowledging the struggles involved in youth unemployment, perhaps even depression or humble beginnings, it isn't typically done in a public forum. So even if a young person is open about sharing this type of information, we sometimes find that there's uncertainty or even confusion around how a story will be used. So how have we responded to this? I found it's been crucial to help young people understand the reason behind storytelling, what they can achieve through telling their stories, the many different forms that stories can take. When my colleagues and I have identified a young person who we think has a very important story to share, I'll often share with them a few examples of other youth who have told their stories and have seen a result, who've seen a concrete outcome that brought them personal benefit and also helped a broader cause of youth employment. I think it's also really important to be crystal clear with each young person as to how their story might be used and the types of people who are likely to read it. Given the close family units in the region where we operate, I'll often ask the subject if they also feel like maybe they should share their story with their family as well before deciding whether or not they want to publicize it. So if we're able to overcome this first obstacle, we found that we often face a second challenge, which is how do you help a young person frame his or her story in a way that feels relevant and meaningful for the audience? You know, as storytelling facilitators, I think everyone in this webinar has an advantage. We have a much better sense of where the audience is coming from and their preconceived notions, and crucially, what the audience might not know and what they need to know to help them understand the environment that a young person came from, or why it's so difficult for a young person to overcome the challenges they did, why a job is more than a paycheck, or what distinctive value a young person can bring to employers. So in response to this challenge, we've developed a couple of different tactics. First, we try to personalize the audience for each young person to help him or her understand really where the audience is coming from. So I'll often explain in very frank terms some of the assumptions that an audience might have to the young storyteller to help him or her understand the way that their words might be perceived. And helping storytellers to understand this prompts them to open up about elements of their lives that they might not otherwise consider worthy of attention. And, you know, at times we also confront confidence issues, particularly when a young person is sharing a story live on TV or at a large global event besides global experts. I particularly remember one young woman, Nisreen, a Palestinian graduate of ours, was invited to speak alongside Nick Kristof of the New York Times and John Chambers of Cisco on the main stage of the Clinton Global Initiative. And she was understandably very nervous. And at moments like this, I try to stress to the storyteller that you are the expert. There is no one in the room who knows your story better than you. And that should be a source of confidence. And finally, I've often felt that it's helpful to ask a young person, a young storyteller, for their help. I present the situation. You know, we're trying to convince a big multinational company to hire more young graduates. And I ask them, based on your experience, what differentiates you from other employees? How can we convince this employer to hire more youth for their first job? So when we are able to convince the young person to open up about their story and to frame it in a way that's powerful for the audience, we often face a third challenge, and that is getting heard. Part of the challenge relates to the storytelling forms that we've traditionally practiced. Since Education for Employment is a nonprofit, our storytelling practices originated in grant reporting requirements. And this means that we have a heritage of telling stories long form, and they often feel formulaic. So it's shifting internally from storytelling for reporting to storytelling that inspires action is a process that we're just beginning to undertake at Education for Employment. And we've started to experiment with photo essays, with amateur video clips, and even with peer-to-peer storytelling to get across the message. And finally, there's another side of the Getting Heard challenge, and that's finding the right platforms that are willing to give young people a chance to speak for themselves, not as victims or as tokens, but as real participants in the public discourse. So in the Middle East and North Africa, youth shoulder almost a double burden here. They not only face the challenge of unemployment, but there's also a perception issue around youth as disruptive threats to society, and they rarely have the chance to set the record straight for themselves. So we found it very helpful to seek out forward-thinking partners who can help us to navigate the problems imposed by this dominant negative narrative in the region. For instance, a couple of years ago, we first partnered with the Huffington Post as a platform where youth can directly share their stories as blogs, and the impact was powerful. So, I mean, these are the challenges that we face and some of the responses that we've developed, and I look forward to learning from others on the line as well to hear ways that they've approached these and other challenges. So back to you.
Follow up with a question about what you're saying, because I think you've provided us with some very tangible, practical ways that you work with young people to explain to them the impact of their story, the consequences of it, what it entails. What's been the reaction that you've found in working with young people once they've seen their story told?
We have found pretty much unanimous positive response. And so we very often find that it takes just one or two young people who are willing to share their stories to inspire whole peer groups to sort of step up to the plate and say, oh, you know, I want to volunteer to share my story. How can I get my story out there?
Well, thank you so much, Mariel. Again, thank you for sharing that practical experience working with young people on the ground. Let's move to Julie Dixon. Julie, you've led Georgetown's Center for Social Impact Communication, and this has really given you an opportunity to see what state-of-the-art communication looks like across sectors, not just working with youth organizations. Give us the evidence base on storytelling, having worked with dozens of NGOs across sectors. Tell us what's working, and maybe more importantly also what's not. Julie?
Sure, thanks, Ami. So the basis for a lot of what I'm going to talk about is a research study that we did a couple years ago at Georgetown in partnership with a foundation here in DC. And we really approached the topic of storytelling from a number of different angles, including a survey of organizations. We did lots and lots of interviews with organizations of all shapes and sizes, and really arrived at kind of a core group of challenges and solutions, and you know, things that organizations typically struggle with, and I really think that those kind of break into kind of three different categories. There's the culture piece, and really creating a culture within your organization that supports storytelling, that makes it sustainable, that makes it scalable. To borrow, you know, some of Sarah's language at the top of the webinar as she was talking, you know, storytelling is something that needs to be sustainable and scalable, just as our work needs to be. The second bucket was kind of the creation and the production of stories. And then the third was really in the sharing and the engaging others, as whether you're using your website, you're using social media, you're using any number of different platforms. So I've boiled all of that down into 3 tips that we see on the slide here, and each one of these I could talk at length about, but I'm going to kind of go quickly. So the first one, in terms of what we're seeing that really works, and on the flip side that, you know, doesn't work for some organizations, is having a really unified definition of story within your organization. I think there's a misconception that you know, we all learn what stories are as children. We learn sort of the basic skeleton of a story, but I think, you know, what we see is by the time we're working in our organizations, that definition tends to fall by the wayside. And in our analysis, we looked at hundreds and hundreds of pieces of content, and I emphasize the word content because not everything that we looked at would meet the definition of story, in that it has As Charlie said, it has some sort of a struggle. It has some sort of a conflict. It focuses on a character. The character is different at the end of the story than they were at the beginning. And about half of the content that we looked at did not meet the definition of story. And I think it's really important because if you think about collecting stories within your organization, and the process that you need to make that happen often includes multiple individuals. It includes somebody from the program team. It includes somebody perhaps from the fundraising or communications team. And so really arriving at a concrete definition of when we say story, what are we talking about? What are we trying to collect? And that can be as tangible as saying, you know, when you're out in the field talking to youth or talking to students or employees, what are the 3 things that you need to bring back to create a story? Are there particular photos that you want to get? Are there, you know, particular questions or quotes or things that you're trying to ask? But as much as you can arrive at a unified organizational definition of story, that will make your collection efforts, your share efforts that much better. The second piece is on the sort of creation production aspect. I think another misconception, and I think that we saw organizations really buying into, was the fact that they needed to share sort of the biggest, most dramatic transformation in an individual, and that's what makes the best story. And that's a misconception. What we saw, what really works in terms of the kinds of stories that are having the best impact are sometimes the smaller stories. A great example that I like to give here in the U.S., and this comes more from a policy realm, but there was an individual that had a story published about him in the Detroit Free Press a couple of years ago about his commute back and forth to work every day. He walked and took public transportation about 6 to 8 hours every day, and then worked, and then had to do the 6 to 8 hour trip back again in the evening. And this is such a huge, you know, dramatic example of failures of transportation policy in Detroit. And what was interesting is when people heard that story, they donated money to the individual. Ford donated him a car. You wanted to help the individual rather than the issue. And so that's one of the side effects. If you focus on the biggest, most dramatic story that illustrates, you know, the biggest transformation, number one, it's harder for most people in your audience to relate to. And number two, it's not sustainable. Again, if sustainability is our goal, there's going to be a lot fewer of those big sort of unicorn examples of big transformations than there are the everyday stories. And an everyday kind of small moment of transformation can have as big, if not bigger, an impact than, you know, these really, really large stories that we feel pressure to tell. And the final piece I wanted to mention is this idea of sharing. And there's a sense for if we build it, they will come. If we tell a great story, it doesn't matter where it is on our website or how buried it is on social media, you know, people will be able to find it. And that's just not true. We asked organizations in our survey, you know, what channels are you using to share stories, and how do you feel about their effectiveness? And far and away, website was the, you know, channel that folks were using the most, but almost half of them said that it wasn't particularly effective. And we dug into that a little bit and found that probably one of the reasons why it's not as effective as a channel is because people just can't find them on our sites. Only about a third of the organizations that we looked at had stories anywhere on the homepage of their website. Most of them were buried on, you know, various tabs. And the presentation is really, really important, not just for our audiences to be able to find and discover our stories, but also for them to be able to act on them. It's really important to have a really clear call to action next to your story, whether that's part of the video or it's, you know, alongside it in the website, making sure that people have a really, really clear sense, not only what you want them to do, but how they can do it. Ami?
Thank you, Julie. I think you made a very simple yet profound insight that big story does not equal big impact. And I think organizations sometimes struggle to look for that big story, but in fact, it's some of the smaller stories that can really lead to change and lead to people understanding the depth and complexity of some of these issues. Julie, tell us, what are the 3 organizations, you've worked with so many, tell us what are the 3 things that organizations can do to improve their stories?
Sure. So the first one, and this sounds a little counterintuitive, but it's don't ask people for stories when you're trying to collect. And this holds true whether you are, if you have a form on your website that you're using to collect stories. A lot of organizations make use of, web forms, or they put the call out on social media, or even when you're having a face-to-face conversation with an individual. The word story is really intimidating, and as I mentioned earlier, people have really different definitions of what we mean by story. And so I always say just completely avoid the word altogether. Ask for experiences, ask for memories, ask for perspectives. Give them, a situation, prompt them, and allow them to react to it. And the funny thing is what you'll get back are stories, or at least, they're anecdotes that you can craft into a story. So just, completely avoid that word when you're talking to people, and you'll get back much, much better content that can be crafted into stories. The second is to, as an organization, to really relegate yourself to more of a supporting role. It's interesting, when we look at the types of heroes that are featured in stories, we saw a lot of stories really promote the organization as the hero rather than the individual. And that can be in how the story is titled. It can be in the language that we use. But, we saw a lot of stories that really elevate the role of the organization, say, we were responsible for this. And they're really not giving their audience enough credit, because our audiences, whether they're on your social media, they're on their website, they know, that it's the organization that has supported the individual. We don't have to be as overt in saying that in our stories, but really putting the focus on the individual, the youth, letting them, again, what I loved, somebody mentioned earlier, the idea of the first person accounts. Really take the organization out of it. Our audiences will understand intuitively our role in supporting these individuals, so we don't have to say it. And the third is in the sharing. And this is a trend that we've really seen emerging in the past couple of years as there are more and more platforms for us to be sharing our stories on. I think there's a misconception that we can kind of create it once and publish it everywhere. In fact, that used to be kind of a saying. And what we're seeing is that, you really, in order to get the most out of your stories, you have to tailor them specifically for the platform that they're going to be shared on. And so whether that's tailoring it for Facebook, and that's everything from making sure that the image is the right size to making sure that you're using the right number of characters to really maximize your engagement, to looking at a new platform like Snapchat that has a completely different style and convention of storytelling. They're using a lot of video, they're using filters and certain language and emojis and things like that. The platforms, there are so many of them now. The good news is there's lots of really great opportunities to be creative across these platforms. The bad news is for a story to really play well on a particular platform, it needs to be 100% tailored towards that platform. Ami?
Thank you, Julie. So tell us some of these low-cost tools or resources that exist for youth organizations which they can tap in supporting their work.
Sure. I have three that I wanted to share. The first one in the upper left corner is a plug for the research that I mentioned earlier. This is a project called Stories Worth Telling that I worked on when I was at Georgetown. There's a couple parts to this research. There is probably a 60-something page white paper that, don't be afraid of the word white paper. It's actually very bite-sized. It's very digestible, and it's filled with examples and case studies and, really, really interesting tips on all the things I kind of touched on there around developing a stronger storytelling culture within your organization, about sharing them more effectively across different platforms, about creating and making sure that your stories have all of the elements necessary to really be effective. There's also a couple other interesting interactive tools that go along with that. There's a few videos that I recorded that walk through how to set up a story bank and how to tailor your stories across platforms. So there's a lot of resources at that link. The second one is a resource that the Rockefeller Foundation actually developed called Hatch for Good. Wonderful platform with tons and tons of tips and worksheets and toolkits and things, really emphasizing storytelling strategy, making sure that it's a strategic part of the way that you're communicating, and again, it focuses on some of the culture and the internal systems. And finally, the one at the bottom is a platform that I like. If you're thinking about how to manage the process of collecting and managing and coordinating stories internally. This is a great collaborative tool that's open source. It plugs into a lot of different content management systems, so we'll plug into a lot of different websites. But it allows you to collect stories. You can design your own intake form, and then it really coordinates the process. You can have multiple people working on this tool at once, tagging stories with different keywords, updating them, with notes that say this story was shared with this particular news outlet, or you can kind of track metrics and things like that in here. So it's a great tool. A lot of these exist, but this is a nice free open source one that was developed by the advocacy arm of Consumer Reports. So yeah, back to you.
So thanks, Julie. Thanks for putting that in perspective for us and sharing some practical tools. What we're going to do now is open it up for the next 15, 20 minutes. We have a generous amount of time so that audience and participants can really ask some burning or specific questions that they've been struggling with, or even more general ones coming to their mind as they heard the panelists speak. Something actually, Julie, that you pointed to about taking the organization out of the equation. I'd like to actually pose that question back to both Charlie and maybe Mariel, representing one of these organizations. How do you do that, and what do you see as the value of taking the organization out? The organization has a role to play in terms of promoting their work and being able to raise the resources necessary for these programs to continue. So what's the balance or the value? How do you pitch that to an organization to take themselves out of the story and to focus on the young person? Charlie, maybe I'll ask you that question, and then we can hear Mariel's thoughts too.
Sure, thanks. I think I might answer that two ways. One would be from our own perspective as an organization, which is Ground Truth is about really training and supporting a new generation to tell the most important stories of their generation. So we're looking to work with a new generation of journalists and then just get out of the way and let them find their way forward to tell the story, to give them a platform for sure, but to also help them distribute their work and kind of launch them. So as we're doing our job, if we can get out of the way and let that happen. Then to flip it around as a journalist and as someone working with young journalists, I think everyone knows when public relations is happening and they naturally recoil. If you try to come at it as how great your organization is, I don't think young storytellers will resonate with it as much as just focus on what you're doing. Let the stories speak for themselves, and that, that's very much part of the message here, and I think a really important one for these organizations to hear. Let the people in your organization, the people you're helping, tell the story themselves.
Mariel, what do you think about that? How do you convince folks at EFE, your senior executives, that this is not about EFE's story, but it's about the young people?
Well, first I should acknowledge that for us, it's, we're still in that process. We're still internalizing that message, and I think that we've internalized it more in the past few years as we've seen precisely what Charlie talked about, which is you cannot pitch stories to, to play my role. I pitch stories to media or to conferences to get young people on stage and sharing their stories personally, and it's just not effective if the story is about an organization. The story, an organization will enter the story naturally. I could never pitch to, a conference or to a media outlet that, this is someone who is going to provide you with a perspective about my organization. It's so much more effective to say this is a young person who is living the real experience. And, the organization will arise in that naturally. So I think that just as Charlie said, you kind of get out of the way of the story, and we've had success approaching it in that way.
Two questions that have come in about the impact of these stories. One is from Cole Simcoe, and the other is from Bonnie Polis, but there's two angles to their questions. Cole's question is about what is the impact does the story have moving forward on the individual and the group that's involved in these stories. So he's asking about the action after the impact. And Bonnie's question is about the impact of storytelling on policymakers, private sector, and the public sector that can lead to really sustainable change in hiring and building career pathways for young people. So she asks particularly about young people in high-risk environments.
Sure.
Go ahead, Mariel.
So to address the first question, what is the impact of a story on the specific storyteller and then on the group they represent? So as an implementing organization, I have found that the impact on the individual is really immense. I mean, having the opportunity to share where you came from and what matters to you, and particularly to give advice to decision makers about what they should do to fix or ameliorate some of the challenges that you faced in your life, that is an incredibly empowering experience. And so we've often found that very often some of our best storytellers end up playing pretty significant roles. They become advocates in their communities and also at times on the international stage for the issue that they represent. How does this impact the group that they represent? The main impact that we focus on at Education for Employment is, are these stories translating into the resources that we need to train and place more young people in jobs? And, in that regard, we have found stories to be one of the most effective ways for us to convince donors to support this cause and to convince employers to engage. And I think this actually leads into the second question: what is the impact of these stories on policymakers and on the engagement of the private and public sector in this issue? I can share with an employer statistics about retention and statistics about creativity or career progression of first-time job seekers. But it's been my experience, because I work with a lot of the major corporate partners that EFU works with, what ultimately gets a person to really buy into this issue and agree that it's a priority and that it's an urgent priority for their organization, it's more often than not a story of a young person who feels a little bit familiar to them and also who has so clearly benefited their business. And so, I could point to a number of different, partnerships even that we've developed that have resulted in job placements for youth or have resulted in new resources for us to be able to train more youth. And those partnerships came about because someone read a really powerful story. So I think that if we're able to get the stories to the right audiences, the impact can be tremendous.
Thank you, Mariel.
If I could, it's Charlie. I was going to jump in on that just for a second, if I could.
Absolutely.
And I also think it picks up really nicely on another question that's coming to all of us from Kirthi, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, about the founder of the Red Elephant Foundation, talking about how do you authenticate stories? How do you know when they're authentic? And I would just say, to riff off of that, the last question and this future question, this is about embracing what it is to be a journalist, which is to just embrace the narrative for all of its complexity and let it take you where it takes you rather than trying to think about policy impact. As journalists, we always want to have impact. We dream about having stories that will change policy for the better and make people's lives better. That's when your job is really fulfilling and when you're doing it really well. But I think it's a strange part of the craft or the art of storytelling that you can't go at it with that in mind. I don't think you can engineer change. I think you can just find really true, complex stories and tell them as best you can, or help people tell their own story with all of its complexity and sort of let the chips fall where they will. Some of these stories may highlight problems that aren't even being thought through yet. Some might suggest policy remedies that can be picked up upon. But I think as a journalist, and a bit of a purist in this realm, I'd say our job is to really just embrace everything that is complex about the story and follow all the contours naturally and don't try to think policy change.
Julie, would you have something to offer or add on this issue of impact and what it means to convince policymakers or the private sector or public sector to make the change they need in terms of hiring practices, job creation, opening employment doors, particularly to young people who are in vulnerable positions?
Sure, a couple of things. So I agree with what Charlie was saying about, just really letting the story be what it is and not trying to force a really sort of prescriptive solution on a policymaker. I think the second part of that is, letting the story speak to itself and making sure that you're telling it and sharing it in a way that reaches those individuals. And that's kind of your equation. It's, making sure that the content is there and also that you're communicating in a way that reaches those folks. And hopefully when you have a good match between those two, you will see the kinds of successes. I also want to build on what Mario was saying too about how she's tracking impact. I think that's so important because, and this is both to foster a more supportive internal culture for storytelling. Whether you're working with senior leadership or your boards, there's probably a lot of questions. I mean, storytelling is not free. I think it can be expensive if you're producing videos or you're investing in new technology or whatever. And a lot of times people will question that investment if you can't back it up to say, this is what our impact was. And so what I love what Mario was saying is that they're tracking success not only quantitatively but qualitatively. It's more than just the clicks and the hits and the likes and shares and things that you're getting online. It's a lot harder to measure the qualitative, but that's where the real value is. You can track, conversations that you're having with people. You can track successes more at that qualitative level. I worked with an organization that said, the way that they track success is somebody mails them a check, and on the memo line of the check it wrote, the name of a particular story or name of an individual whose story moved them to donate. And that's not something that's going to show up in a Google Analytics report on your website, but it probably is more valuable. So being able to track those qualitative impacts and almost quantify those, you can create a spreadsheet that says, this is the number of conversations that I had with individuals who mentioned particular stories, but really thinking about tracking impact in a qualitative way, not just in clicks and hits and things like that.
Great. Thank you, Julie. This is a question that's come in from Sarah Powers. She's asking, what calls to action have we or you used when telling these stories to the general public? So how can the average person take the momentum or inspiration from a story and do something about it? Muriel, have you had experience with calls to action and embedding that in some of the stories you've had about young people in, for example, Morocco?
Sure. So I first want to say I think that at one of the decisions that we had actually made at EFE, because it can be a big effort and a big investment to tell stories really well, is that we're really careful about the audiences that we're investing in terms of how we're targeting stories. So we don't have a lot of experience speaking to a general audience with our stories. When we do a call to action for a general audience, depending on where that audience is based, it might be one of two things. If the audience is outside of the Middle East and North Africa, generally the call to action that we have is rethink how you are thinking about this speech. It is crucial for us, for the success of our work, that young people in the Middle East and North Africa are not perceived to be a threat or a liability to their society. We need them to be seen as an asset. And so that is probably the main call to action. We ask people to rethink and re-examine their assumptions about the region. More specifically, when we're talking about calls to action locally, we do use that same frame, that same call to action, rethink how you are considering youth, but we really try to be more specific than that. If we are writing a story that is targeting employers, our call to action is, get engaged in youth employment by prioritizing hiring first-time job seekers in your company, or by mentoring, or by offering internships. If we're targeting donors, our call to action is add this to your portfolio out of a recognition that it is a social and economic priority in the Middle East and North Africa for long-term sustainable change. Amy, back to you.
Thank you, Mariel. So I think we've got time for about one more question, and this one comes from Sarah Slade, and it's a good one to consider for Charlie and maybe also Julie. But in your experience, Charlie, covering the Middle East and North Africa, have you seen a greater uptake in the mainstream media, whether it's international or even local press, where there's more positive narratives of young people? And if so, how do you, what factors have led to that, do you think? Charlie?
Well, I think in the Middle East, sadly, I would say no. I have not seen an uptake in more positive stories, particularly if you take the 5 years since, say, the 2011 beginning of the Arab Spring. I would call it a 100-year turning point in the Middle East, a time when people actually spoke out through the power of social media. We were on the sort of the edge, this teetering edge of the most dramatic change I've ever seen in my lifetime, 30 years of covering the Middle East. I was so excited about it, as were so many of the young people gathered in Tahrir Square. I think one of the really sad realities of the moment we're in is that you're not hearing those young people anymore. I think a lot of the really negative forces in the region, the old regimes have come back, and the young people I'm talking to in Egypt are just incredibly cynical and depressed about that. How do we move them forward now? How do we get them to keep telling their story, to not give up, to recognize that Facebook is not enough of a movement? Political action and real change, real revolution takes years, and it needs to be sustained. And I think there's a real role for NGOs to inspire a young generation, and for civil society to work hard to give the institutions for real change to come. I think we've been really remiss in that, and I think that's the story we need to tell about the Middle East now, that the new stasis that we've hit is something that we can't like sort of tolerate. We have to be impatient with it, and I think we're not doing enough of that as journalists, and myself included. I feel like really eager to keep pushing the story. But I'm sorry, it's just not great news. I don't want to sugarcoat it. I think it's actually a really challenging moment.
Julie, are you seeing a similar trend?
I mean, I think I can't really comment on the state of sort of youth employment-focused stories, but I think one thing that is relevant to this question is a trend over the past 4 or 5 years, so similar time frame, in organizations bypassing traditional media and really taking it into their own hands to tell their stories, obviously because we all have so many platforms now that we can be using. And it's almost like rather than pitching stories directly to media, they're sharing them on their own platforms, and then that's how media is then picking up those stories. So there's a change in how the stories are shared, who they're shared with, and how they eventually make it into kind of mainstream or traditional media, which can be a great thing for organizations if you have sophisticated ways of sharing your own stories, and it's also an opportunity for organizations who maybe are still sort of relying on the typical, pitching, media relations, trying to get stories to journalists. And I think to an earlier point, especially if you're looking at trying to tell really, really authentic stories, letting the stories speak for themselves, that doesn't always necessarily involve that typical pitching PR side of things when you're working with media.
Thank you, Julie. And I think you raised a really good point about young people now with the new technology that's out there having the ability to take some of these storytelling into their own hands, and then really traditional media following that.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few minutes remaining, and what we wanted to do in that time frame is just introduce the audience and the participants to a new platform, and this is really just one effort that the Global Center for Youth Employment has been able to invest in. And for those of you who may not be familiar with it, the Global Center for Youth Employment, this is really a virtual center with over 40 international and national organizations that have come together to essentially, make some collective impact or contribution in the area of youth and economic opportunities. So there's a platform which is called Youth Voices, and this site really has a very specific purpose. It really is about sharing first-person accounts and first-person youth narratives, especially related to youth and their situation in terms of a search for a job or their aspirations for careers. The site was launched in April, so it's very new, and it's still a work in progress. We'd obviously love to hear feedback on how we can improve it. We've also got thoughts, but we're seeing some early traction, and that's good. We've already had about 400 posts from young people, and we had an opportunity to just do some internal review of those posts in terms of the trends or the issues we're seeing percolating up from those stories. And one of the issues that came to the forefront is really the importance of family and family influence on young people's education and their labor market outcomes. And in fact, when we did a search of family or family dynamics, about 60%, if not more, of the posts were flagged in terms of having some relation or some contribution about the role of family, whether positive or negative, in terms of how they thought about their dream career or how they thought about what was standing in the way of achieving it. Some of the other areas or topics that we saw were flagged, again, by young people themselves are about finances and what it takes for them to get to their dream job, or what it takes for them to invest in the training that they need. So finances came up also very significantly. We also saw, and you can see from what's being scrolled on the screen, hopefully, a lot of hope and optimism that was coming from the young people themselves, coupled with a lot of perseverance, a lot of stories of perseverance and having to overcome challenges. And I think this also goes back to the point that Julie and Charlie and really all of our panelists were making about the complexity and being able to share some of the complexity of the stories that these young people are living. So I think the center sees a number of benefits of a site like this. Obviously, one is getting the story out there, but from a research perspective, it does help researchers, policymakers, programmers have firsthand accounts from young people in their own words, narrating experiences on careers and jobs, and how we can take that information and translate that, to respond again to some of the questions about impact, how we translate that into programs, strategies, approaches, or policies. I think it's also really exciting, and I'd love to ask Charlie to speak a little bit more about this, but the center has formed some editorial partnerships with global media outlets such as Huffington Post, Atlantic Monthly, and PBS, who've all agreed to run some of the stories that are posted on this site. And with the real purpose, again, of what we've all been talking about here, which is to amplify the youth voice and the issue that young people are facing in their everyday lives. So, Charlie, I'd love to hear. You're very close to this to the creation of this site, and I think you probably have some great ideas, even of just where you see it going. But I'd love to hear your perspective on the value of such a site and how you see it being leveraged, hopefully, by organizations and young people around the world. Charlie?
Thanks. I do feel very close to it, but I want to just hasten to add that RTI and the center, and particularly my colleague Kevin Grant, who's our managing editor at Ground Truth, have really been the energy behind building it. It's really exciting to see it coming together and to see it starting to get traction, as you pointed out. I think we have a long way to go, though. I think we need to expand the audience, and we need to expand the number of people who are coming into the site and seeing it as a way to really engage with storytelling. There's really an ocean of stories to be told out there. The question is, how do we direct that flow in this direction, and how can we then leverage it from youth voices out to wider media? As you pointed out, we've got partnerships with Huffington Post, with Public Radio International, The World, and others who we want to keep pursuing and keep opening up. We feel like at the Ground Truth Project, we're in a position to be brokers of these stories, because we're trying to not only build that user-generated content platform, but also from that platform pull out storytellers who we think could be professional storytellers, also known as journalists, and really get them inspired at a time of incredible excitement in journalism. This is a revolutionary moment that we're in, but it's also a really challenging time where it's hard to find opportunities, where things are shifting, and where the terrain is very uneven and sometimes uncertain. So if Ground Truth can do its job, what we're going to do is take youth voices to create a way for stories to be heard, but also try to be these catchers in the rye of these young people who can actually then come forward and tell these great stories to a much wider audience in their country, to their community, that need to be heard, and tell them as journalists using fact-based methods, journalistic approaches, which I think have a unique power even in this age of social media, and even in an age in which so many people, as has been pointed out, are bypassing traditional media. I believe in bypassing traditional media, but I still believe in holding on to the real values of great journalism, of trying to catch many sides, of embracing complexity. And so we see the platform in two ways that way. It's a great place to tell the stories that need to be heard from many different perspectives, but also a tool, we hope, to help us in our mission to train a new generation of correspondents to tell the stories that matter.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much for that. And we've already come up on our hour. An hour goes by quickly, but we really do hope that participants found this at least as an initiation of a conversation, a dialogue about how we can collectively tell this story of young people and the challenges and potential and aspirations they have when it comes to their lives, and particularly their livelihoods. We want to close with just conducting a poll. You'll see the questions that is up there. Which of the following opportunities to improve your organization's storytelling capacity would you be most interested in? And the idea here is that we want to be able to take this conversation forward, whether it's an opportunity to hold a workshop or a second seminar, for example, at the upcoming Making Sense Youth Economic Opportunity Summit in September, or other methods that the Global Center has at its disposal. So it's great to see some of the responses. It looks like open source tools are definitely an area that we need to do more sharing and collaborating around. Let me ask the panelists if they have any final comments before we close. I think I just wanted to make 2 points, which is one is definitely to encourage everyone to go to the Youth Voices site, see what they think about this site, if it's something of value, if it's not, what ways they think we could improve it. I'd also encourage everyone to go to the resources that Julie shared in her last slide. And if you've got comments, questions, feedback, I know the Global Center would love to hear from you. This is, again, about us working towards a common vision and mission about how we tell the story better, and we all have examples and expertise we can share with each other. So please do reach out. You'll see the email up there on the presentation slide. And so let me just ask Charlie, Julie, or Marielle if you have any final comments, and otherwise we can turn it over to Sarah to close.
I would just jump in to conclude briefly that I really enjoyed this. I think it was a really important gathering. Thank you for hosting it. I've been in the business of storytelling for a long time, and I learned a lot. I really think the practical advice that Marielle and Julie are giving about storytelling is much needed. And I think there's a lot of ways we can really come together now that we haven't explored enough. How do we work together to get a new generation telling its story? And I'm really excited about some of the partnerships, some of the ways we can work together. So looking forward to that.
To echo those words, I'm so thrilled that we have this conversation. It is incredibly important as an implementing organization to get the chance to hear the media perspective that Charlie shared, and I'm likewise so excited to dive into the resources that Julie shared. So I want to thank you for convening this this forum, and we really look forward to moving forward with what we've learned here.
Just to echo what both Charlie and Marielle said, this has been wonderful, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation about all things storytelling. So thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of it today.
Thank you. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Ami, for your great facilitation today, and again to Marielle, Charles, and Julie for your perspectives and expertise on this topic. It's been really, really interesting. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you. I think Ami mentioned the Global Youth Economic Opportunity Summit this September from the 28th to the 30th in Washington, D.C. You can register and learn more about the event at www.youtheosummit.org. We also take M&E seriously, and we'd like to ensure the quality of our learning events in terms of content and delivery. So at this time, we're going to open an evaluation form, which should pop up in your browser, and it can also be accessed via the link below. And this will take less than 2 minutes to complete. We'd be really grateful if you would just fill out this evaluation so that we can ensure the future learning events we host are quality and relevant. And lastly, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on www.youtheconomicopportunities.org, and you'll receive a link via email. If you found this webinar useful, we encourage you to promote this webinar recording to others in your network who might also benefit from the content. Thank you so much again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your week.